Welcome to the Forge Over 40 podcast. My name is Steve Didier, and this show is for high performers who refuse to let their edge quietly erode. If you've built companies, led teams, carried responsibility for decades, but lately your focus feels duller, decisions feel heavier, and your mental stamina isn't quite what it used to be, this show is where we rebuild the biological systems that your leadership depends on. And we do it on a physiological level. We're going to get this going strong today. You didn't suddenly lose your edge. You didn't wake up one day and forget how to work, how to train, or how to stay disciplined. In fact, if anything, you're probably doing more now than you were 10 or 15 years ago. You've got more structure, more awareness, and more responsibility. From the outside, it looks like you're operating at a higher level than ever before. And yet, something feels off. Not dramatically, not in a way that stops you from functioning, but enough that you notice it, enough that you feel it in the background of every single day. Getting moving in the morning takes more effort than it used to. Your energy doesn't feel as steady. You can still focus, but it comes in waves instead of staying locked in. It's probably a subtle friction in the things that used to feel automatic. And that's the part that doesn't really make sense, because if you look at what you're doing, nothing is obviously wrong. You're still showing up, you're still executing, you're still holding a level that most people can never come close to. So why does it feel harder? Most people answer that question the wrong way. They assume it's stress, or they assume it's age, or they assume they need to just tighten things up and get sharper again. But that's not actually what's happening. What you're feeling is a metabolic shift, not a dramatic one. And that's really what it makes it so easy to miss. This isn't something that hits all at once. It builds gradually underneath the surface until you reach a point where the same life starts producing a different internal experience. Think about it like this. In business, there's a phase where everything runs clean. Revenue's coming in, margins are strong, and you have room to make decisions without feeling pressure from every single direction. You can absorb mistakes, pivot when needed, and still maintain forward momentum. There's a sense of ease in how things operate. Then, as things grow, something changes. The business might still be performing. Revenue may even be higher than it's ever been, but the margins start tightening. Costs increase and there's less room for error. Decisions carry more weight, and the consequences of getting them wrong becomes more significant. From the outside, everything still looks solid, but internally, it feels tighter, more constrained, less forgiving. And that's exactly what's happening in your body. Your metabolism is your margin. As you move through your 40s, especially as a high performer who has been operating under sustained pressure for years, that margin starts to shrink. You're still producing energy, but not as efficiently. You're still recovering, but not as completely. You're still functioning at a very high level, but without the same buffer that made everything feel so much easier before. And that buffer is what most people don't even realize they had. When your metabolism is working well, you don't think about energy. You don't think about focus. You don't think about recovery. Those things are just there. They support you in the background while you focus on everything else. But when that system starts to lose efficiency, you feel it everywhere. Your blood sugar becomes less stable, which means your energy starts to fluctuate more during the day. You may find yourself relying on caffeine just to feel normal in the morning or to stay reasonably sharp in the afternoon. Your thyroid function, specifically the conversion of thyroid hormones into their active form, becomes less efficient under chronic stress. That affects how your body turns fuel into usable energy. So, even if you're eating well and doing the right things, it doesn't feel like it's translating in the same way. At the cellular level, your mitochondria, which are responsible for producing energy, they become less effective when they've been exposed to years of stress, poor recovery, and inconsistent fueling. So the entire system starts operating with less output. None of this feels dramatic when it's happening. And that's why it's so easy to ignore. You just adapt to it. You push through it. You assume it's normal until you hit a point where you start to question it. Like, when did this start feeling like work? And this is where most high performers make the wrong move. They respond by trying to increase intensity. They train harder. They try to be more disciplined. They push themselves to operate the way they used to, assuming that the answer is more effort. But this is not an effort problem. It is an efficiency problem. You're asking a system that is producing less usable energy to maintain the same level of output it used to handle easily. And when you do that, everything starts to feel heavier. Not because you've changed, but because the system supporting you has changed. I went through a phase where this became very obvious to me personally. On paper, everything looked solid. Training was consistent, work was moving, structure was in place, but it felt like I was constantly pushing through something that I couldn't quite define. It wasn't burnout. It wasn't exhaustion. It was just a constant layer of resistance that was never there before. And like most guys, my first instinct was to double down, tighten things up, push harder, force my way back to where I had been, more discipline, more effort. That didn't fix it. It ended up making it worse because I wasn't dealing with a lack of effort. I was dealing with a system that had crossed a threshold. And once you cross that threshold, the rules change. Whether you acknowledge it or not, once you cross that threshold, the way your body responds to everything starts to change, even if your behavior doesn't. And that's the part that throws people off. Because from your perspective, you're still doing the same things. You're working out, you're staying active, you're handling all of your responsibilities. So logically, you're going to expect the same results. But the system you're operating inside of is no longer responding in the same way that it used to. Going back to that business analogy for a minute, when margins tighten, you don't always see it immediately in terms of revenue. The top line can still look strong. Things can still appear to be working, but internally, every decision carries more weight because there's less room for inefficiency. Small mistakes matter more. Poor timing matters more. Misallocation of resource matters more. And that's exactly how your metabolism starts to behave after that tipping point. You don't have the same room for error anymore. You can still get away with things. It's just going to cost you a lot more than it used to. If your sleep is off for a couple of nights, you feel it more. If your nutrition is inconsistent, your energy drops faster. If you push too hard in the gym without recovering properly, it lingers instead of bouncing back. Everything becomes more sensitive, and that sensitivity is coming from a few key shifts that are happening underneath the surface. Your insulin sensitivity starts to drift, which means your body is not handling fuel in the same way it used to. Energy becomes less stable, and you start to feel those fluctuations more throughout the day. Your cortisol rhythm becomes less predictable. Instead of rising and falling in a clean pattern, it tends to stay elevated longer, especially if you're constantly under pressure. That keeps your system in a more activated state than it should be, and at the same time, your thyroid conversion is going to become less efficient. You might still be producing enough thyroid hormone, but the conversion into its active form is not happening as effectively. So that happens a lot under chronic stress. It directly impacts how your body turns nutrients into usable energy. Now, layer all those things together. You've got less stable fuel, stress response that doesn't shut off cleanly, and a system that is not converting energy as efficiently as it used to. That combination doesn't shut you down. It just makes everything feel like it takes more effort. And this is why a lot of high performers start to describe their days differently at this stages. They don't say, I'm exhausted. They say things like, I just don't feel as sharp, or I feel like I'm pushing through everything, or I don't have the same gear that I used to. That language matters because it tells you this isn't a collapse, it's a compression. Your capacity hasn't disappeared, but the margin between what you're doing and what your body can support has narrowed. And when that margin gets tight enough, you start to feel it in every part of your day. You notice it in how long it takes to get fully engaged in the morning. You notice it in how your focus drifts in the afternoon. You notice it in how your workouts feel more taxing and less productive. Even things like patience and tolerance for stress start to shift. Situations that you used to handle without thinking now feel like they require more effort to manage. That's not a personality change. That is a capacity issue. And again, this is where a lot of people go wrong. They start trying to optimize around the edges. They change their training program. They experiment with different diets. They add supplements. They look for something that will give them a quick boost back to where they used to be. But that approach misses the bigger picture because this isn't about finding one thing that fixes everything. This is about recognizing that the system as a whole is operating differently. If your margins in a business are shrinking, you don't fix that by making one small adjustment and hoping it solves everything. You look at the entire operation. You look at where resources are being used, where inefficiencies are creeping in, where the system needs to be tightened up or supported differently. That's the level that you have to approach your physiology from. Because right now, you're feeling this shift. What you're experiencing is not random fatigue or lack of discipline. You're feeling the downstream effects of a metabolic system that is no longer as resilient as it used to be. And if you keep treating it like surface level problem, you're going to keep getting surface level results. Short bursts of improvement, temporary fixes, moments where you feel like you might be getting your edge back, followed by a quick return to the same baseline. That cycle is incredibly frustrating because it makes you feel like you're close to figuring it out, but never quite get it. And the reason for that is simple. You're trying to restore performance without rebuilding the system that creates it. Until that changes, the experience won't change. It just gets managed. Once you understand this is a margin problem, not a motivation problem, the entire way you approach it has to change. Because now you're not trying to squeeze more output out of the same system. You're trying to rebuild the system so it can support the level that you're operating at. And that requires an entirely different kind of discipline. Not the discipline to push harder, the discipline to stop operating in a way that's quietly working against you. Most high performers, they don't struggle with effort. They struggle with direction. They apply intensity in the wrong places at the wrong time and then wonder why things aren't improving. If your metabolic margin is shrinking, the first thing you have to look at is not how to do more. It's where you're leaking capacity. So let's start with sleep. Not just how many hours you're in bed, but whether you're actually recovering. If your mind is still running at night, if you're waking up feeling like you didn't fully reset, that's not a small issue anymore. That directly affects your ability to produce energy the next day. And at this stage, poor sleep doesn't just make you a little bit tired. It compounds everything else that's already happening. Then look at how you're fueling yourself. A lot of high performers get lazy here, even if they don't realize it. Meals become inconsistent. You skip them when you're busy and then overcompensate later. You rely on caffeine to bridge the gaps. This might have worked when your system had a little bit more flexibility, but it doesn't work the same way now. Your body needs consistent input to maintain stable energy production. If that input is erratic, your energy becomes erratic. And when your energy is unstable, everything downstream is affected. And then there's exercising. This is the big one because most people in this position still train like they're trying to prove something. They push hard, they chase intensity, they want to feel like they're killing it in the gym. But if your system is already under strain, that approach adds more stress than it creates capacity. Training should build you, not break you down. And if you're consistently walking out of the gym more depleted than when you walked in, that's not performance. That's erosion. So take a step back, look at everything together. Sleep that isn't fully restorative. Nutrition that's inconsistent. Training that's overly aggressive. A high level of mental demand that never really shuts off. Individually, each of those things might seem manageable. Together, they create a system that never fully stabilizes. That's the tipping point, because once you're there, the solution is not to find one thing that fixes everything. It's to bring the system back into alignment. That means creating consistency where there's currently randomness. That means reducing unnecessary stress instead of stacking more on top. It means supporting energy production instead of constantly draining it. None of that requires you to lower your standards. It requires you to raise them, actually, in a different direction. Because right now, if you're feeling this shift, the issue isn't that you've lost your edge. The issue is that you're trying to operate at a high level with a system that hasn't been maintained to support it. And that's a fixable problem. But it's only fixable if you address it correctly. If you don't, this doesn't just stay where it is, it progresses. That subtle friction becomes more noticeable. That drop in energy becomes more consistent. That gap between what you expect from yourself and what you're actually able to deliver gets wider. And eventually, you will hit a point where it's no longer subtle. You don't feel like yourself. You don't think as clearly. You don't have the same drive. And no matter how much you try and push, it won't come back the way it used to. That's where most people finally realize that something's actually wrong. But by then, you're not making adjustments. You're rebuilding from a much lower baseline. So the real question here is simple. Are you going to wait for that point, that threshold? Or are you going to address it while you still have more control over it? Because this has nothing to do with getting older. It's about whether your biology is keeping up with the life that you've built. And if it's not, there's no amount of discipline, no amount of pushing, and no amount of grinding is going to fix it. You don't solve a margin problem by working harder inside a broken system. You solve it by fixing the system. If you do that, things will start to feel right again. Energy will stabilize, focus will sharpen, drive will come back without being forced. If you don't, well, you already know where this goes. If you want to begin rebuilding that foundation, my free 30-day energy reset walks through the exact sequence for restoring metabolic stability, nervous system recovery, and cellular energy production. It's free. Links in the description. Grab that. And just a quick reminder, you do not tolerate mediocrity in your business. Don't tolerate it in your biology. I'll see you all very soon. Take care.